Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. Today we're going to be going over the era between 1750 and 1820, just overall called the Revolutionary Period of the United States. And so we're going to get into a couple of things from the general timeline, but the three that I want us to focus the most on and how it impacts our culture in the United States, but also our sporting culture, is that from 1730 to 1750s, we have the very first Great Awakening and Enlightenment in the American colonies. So, kind of this juxtaposition between a more devout religious lifestyle of Americans versus more of a secularized interpretation of self. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and then consequently the Revolutionary War. Then in 1803, we have the Louisiana Purchase, which for all intents and purposes, for now, really kind of encouraged a westward expansion. And we're going to talk about more rural sports today that was kind of lent in by the Louisiana Purchase as Americans started to immigrate west. Obviously, we have a lot more other things that happened, but really those three things I think kind of, again, generalizable, represent this era very well. But in terms of sports, we have a lot of new sports that we're talking about, right? Last week we had a lot more conversations around utilitarian sport and really kind of how sporting culture was established in the United States. But now we're starting to see a much more rationalized view of sport. We're starting to have a lot more documentation of records, of winners, of names, versus just the general kind of culture of sport. And so we're going to see a lot of different types of sports. So we're going to see a lot about horse racing. We're going to see a lot about, again, more agricultural, rural types of sport. We're also going to talk about yachting, which is kind of the older, more antiquated name for sailing, is a very popular sport for the upper class elites. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we see sport in various medias and modalities and how people started to learn about sport through magazines. And so overall, we find that the Revolutionary period really focused the most popular sports of horse racing, agricultural, and utilitarian type sports. Boxing also became very popularized, more so mainstream than opposed to the blood and sport type of boxing that we covered last week. And then finally, yachting, which again, for all intents and purposes, you can think of as an older form of sailing. And so the following characteristics really influence sport a lot in the area, and we're going to touch on different ways in which all of these kind of values and characteristics are represented in different types in different ways during this era. But we're first going to talk about religion, in which we start to see this unique shift happening between, again, the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, and how both of those things very much kind of allowed us to start to believe in individual human agency versus blindly following God. Then we start to have this kind of newfound desire to have economic independence from England, which again really kind of encourages the consequential Revolutionary War, getting more into the frontier world. We're going to talk about westward expansion. Women start to have a very interesting kind of culture and influence in the sporting and American cultural space. We're going to talk about Native Americans, and then finally how the Revolutionary War changed kind of our entire concept of sport. But overall, we're finding that the American identity is changing. It's evolving away from this European English mindset into new ideas and new values surrounding religion, politics, economics, sport, and work. And so again, to kind of get into more details of these things, we started to kind of have a more secularized view of sport and really kind of believing in our own individual human agency. We also are trying to find this newfound independence from England, from other European influences that really allowed people to pursue a new democratic government. So this new interest in politics and independence. We also have a lot more of economic interests and economic investments and how we're westward expansion. We're utilizing the land. We are establishing trade networks and industrialization. We're also utilizing sport as a way for self-improvement and a desire for upward social mobility. So utilizing sport and other means to start to establish new social hierarchies and new capital points in which we can establish powers over others, but really just trying to make a better name for ourselves and our communities. This was a time that was very tumultuous, obviously because of this kind of intrinsic fight between English values and these new American values and the impending war. And Benjamin Franklin, in my opinion, is the greatest representation of this new American culture. He is English, but he valued personal virtue. He really liked the idea of self-help, the idea of our personal agencies versus placing a lot of power in faith. And so he really placed a lot of great value on mental and physical exercise. And he was actually one of the best swimmers in England at the time, but relinquished that dream to really establish and be a pinnacle or kind of this trailblazer for these new American values. And so first I want to spend some time talking about how religion and secularization kind of shifted our American values of sport being very demonized into sport being something that can be very positive for the growth of these new American values. But the first thing we need to talk about is the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening, the first one, was a religious revival that appealed to a lot of working class and poor Americans because a lot of the sermons were very emotional, they were very charismatic, and it led to a lot of religious splinterings, a lot of religious divisions, as we're going to talk about in a little bit. Essentially, what we have in the Great Awakening was that a lot of people believed entirely in God's agency to control the world and its happenings. It focused a lot on belief as opposed to sacrament. So this appealed to a lot of poor Americans that didn't necessarily have anything to provide in terms of sacrament, in terms of money to donate to the church, or other types of demonstrative actions, and really focused a lot on a belief system. So if you were able to believe in God, feelings of God, then that was enough for you to be a good Christian. We found that a lot of folks who followed the Great Awakening still demonized sport as kind of a distraction from this religious kind of inclination. However, they would still play. So this was one of the very first of many examples during this era in which the folks who engaged in sport were very hypocritical about how they would go about it. And again, we're going to get into more of those details in a moment. However, we found that there is a greater counterculture to the Great Awakening in the form of what we call the Enlightenment. And so the Enlightenment, if you can kind of think of other folks of influence, John Locke really started to develop ideas about the human mind and political philosophies. Isaac Newton really encouraged the Enlightenment. He developed laws of nature and advancements in scientific revolution. But essentially, the Enlightenment was a direct challenge to the Great Awakening because it really emphasized this scientific and very logical view of the world, in a sense that it really started to kind of shift this idea away from God's agency into human agency, into our personal responsibility for self. And so people, mostly the colonial elite upper class, acquired a lot more social and political freedoms and really kind of encouraged the application of science, logic, and reason for knowledge acquisition. And so sport as an entity became a new source of this knowledge acquisition. The idea that sport can be a new science for physical health. And so these are kind of the two kind of cultural waves that are happening in the Americas at the time. And so we found that the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment impacted colonies in different ways. We found that in northern colonies, there was a lot of conflict between these two views, in the sense that some folks would see sport as a distraction from God, while others saw sport to better one's health, right? So this idea, this kind of crux or the dichotomy of religious adherences of sport being a distraction from God, while still acknowledging that sport can be a way to encourage bodily health, to encourage religious revival in the sense that you're able to do more for your community, you're able to spread the gospel in those ways. And so a lot of Puritans would have a lot of open air sermons at this time, again, urging people to devote their lives to God and not the sins of amusement and sport. But the upper class, who again saw sport as a new science, very much liked sport and wanted to incorporate sport into this space. And so the northern colonies had a little bit of conflict, again, as we talked about the Pilgrims being traditionally working or lower class individuals versus the Pilgrims being very working lower class versus the Puritans that were typically upper class, more educated. We saw that conflict there. In the southern colonies, we overall saw a greater influence from the Great Awakening as opposed to the Enlightenment. And so oftentimes a lot of these southern colonies would preach the gospel, but kind of again to highlight this hypocrisy, they would utilize the idea, or they would emphasize this idea of individualism to see sport as promoting the self. And so depending on where you were in terms of this splintering, sometimes we would have Baptist, Methodists that would preach different things. But overall, we found that for folks in the South, overwhelmingly, 75% of them would become Southern Baptists. Other folks would be Methodists, but these different Christian sects started to gain a lot of traction by preaching individualism, free from different stratifications based on race, based on age, and based on rank. And so again, for a lot of poorer folks that looked towards the ideas that were all equal under God's eyes, that was very appealing to them. And so sport could still be a place to establish these hierarchies, right? So the idea that we're all equal in God's eyes. However, a lot of people liked the idea of being better than other folks, and so sport was a way to do those things. And so they were in place to establish hierarchies based on sporting performances, based on economic benefit that you would get from playing sport. And so sport continued in these southern colonies, even though there was this greater religious revival that kind of put sport in this very complicated space of how internalized do I say that sport is bad or not, even though sport allows me to have competition between folks who were considered equal than me. So a lot of sports that were popular during the South, or in the South, were horse racing, animal blood sports, cockfighting, and hunting for sport. And so all these things to say is that there were these two greater shifts, the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment era, that really did a lot of influence and kind of coercion in one way or another towards the sporting culture in the colonies. Then we have the emergence of physical education. So again, as people started to become more comfortable with the idea of sport as physical activity being physically beneficial as well as morally beneficial, we started to have more of a systematic acceptance of sport in these educational spaces. Physical education at the time was taught in schools for white Protestant boys to better prepare them for their prescribed gender roles in the future, being businessmen, politicians, leaders of society, right? Their curricula included proper care of the body, mind, and soul, and they started to integrate more of these physical activities into their academic life in order for them to have a more wholesome development of the body, of the mind, of the spirit. And so we're going to come back to that trifecta quite a lot. This is the first introduction for you all to this trifecta of body, mind, and spirit development, and sport being utilized to develop those three characteristics. We're going to find many, many examples of that trifecta in sport later on. But the very first time that we are introduced to these developments of sport is through physical education for young men. Oftentimes these athletic pursuits were very unorganized, in the sense that they would kind of just do whatever they wanted, in the sense that, they had a ball, they didn't really have a lot of rules, but eventually they started to become more regulated, more rationalized, and evolved into university athletic culture that we still have today. Sporting engagement was really reflective of civility and not necessarily vulgarity that a lot of people kind of associated with sport, this kind of unique counterculture of, well, the elites are utilizing sport to develop themselves. It's not thought of as negatively, as nefariously as it was in previous generations. And a lot of the reason why that's happening is because of this consumerism and subsequent tavern culture that we have surrounding sport. This was a time of increased urbanization. There was a rapid population growth, not only from immigrants coming to the colonies, but also for folks who were generationally in the colonies before. And so it brought an increased factory labor era, which then as a consequence brought about an age of consumerism. People had more money, and so they were able to spend money on more leisurely pursuits like sports and this tavern culture, right? I touched on tavern culture a bit last week, but this is where we start to see it flourish. This idea that, again, people had more money, so they wanted to pursue leisurely pursuits of socialization, of sports, of card games, of drinking, of eating, and taverns, bars, were the perfect place to kind of pursue all of these different activities. And so at the time, tavern culture was very popular, but it was challenged in different ways. We find that there is this kind of, again, another example of this hypocritical divide between classes, specifically within this sporting tavern culture. Tavern culture traditionally were places for lower class citizens and folks to enjoy the leisures of each other. They had social interactions. They would eat, drink, gamble, and play games and sports. So all these activities were very much popularized and kind of normalized in the lower class, working class environments, right? They wanted to be amongst folks like them. They wanted to establish different power structures between their own communities. However, many upper class people looked down on lower class activities, right? They wanted to establish themselves as different from lower class individuals. We don't represent their values. And so they started to bash on tavern culture. A lot of upper class folks looked down on tavern culture because it was very boisterous. It was mostly for young people to get drunk and be sinful, right? Enjoying the leisurely pursuits of sports. And so what a lot of upper class folks did was that they took it upon themselves to create more civilized taverns, right? Bringing ideas of nobility and wealth, the secularization that if you're going to come into a place of culture, of class, but they did so with this kind of elitist mindset that they're better than the folks who have done it before. They're just doing it in a different way. And so it very much exposed the hypocrisy and classist divide, especially around this sporting specific space. And so it's kind of one of those things where if you've heard of this trope before, what's trashy if working class people do it, but considered acceptable or praised if upper class folks do it? This is one of the earliest examples of that was sport culture. The idea that people wanted to go towards bars, they wanted to celebrate and be sociable at taverns, that was demonized by lower class folks, but considered acceptable for upper class individuals. And so all this to say, we start to have a lot of interesting appraisals of sport, in which class is one of the most evident examples of this kind of hypocrisy surrounding sport. But we also have to recognize that there are differences in urban interpretations of sport and more rural interpretations of sport. Because again, as we started to expand westward, there was this very different type of appraisal towards sport that was very reflective of the cultures and communities that did expand out west, these very rural, frontier, backcountry type sports. And life on the frontier was extremely physically demanding. It was very rough, it was very physical, but it was also very community oriented in the sense that it was about survival a lot of the time. As they were expanding westward, they had to, deal with Native Americans, whether or not they were forcibly gone back more eastward or if they were in wartime with Native Americans. There was a lot of survival initiatives for folks that were expanding west. And so this was very much in contrast to this life of morality, of work ethic, temperance, religion, individualism that we found in the colonies. This was pretty much about survival of the fittest, about going more into the rural areas. And again, whether that's due to war with Native Americans, but also just survival overall. Where are they getting their food? Where are they getting their shelter? How are they establishing community as they moved west? And so we often found that the sports were very reflective of this culture as well, in which there were a lot of brutal, no-holds fighting, in the sense that there was no holding back against the violent nature of these sports. And as a way for men in these rural communities to showcase their masculinity, their toughness, pride, physical prowess, and courage over other men in these rural communities. Eventually, people started to recognize that there was a lot of social power in who would win these fights, in the sense that if you were a winner, that you were kind of thought of as better than other folks in the communities. And so people started to fake these fights in order to reaffirm various power structures. They would start to reinforce class supremacy, in which the upper class individual would beat and win the lower class individual, or they would have the white person beat and defeat a person of color to reaffirm white supremacy. And so fighting was very powerful social capital at this time in these rural communities, because it was one of the only ways in which you can establish that hierarchy was through sport, through beating the crap out of one another. And we see that in many different examples. Another very popularized sport is horse racing. Horse breeding and horse racing was extremely popular, very practical for a lot of people in the United States, and people took immense pride in their horses and would spend a concerted amount of money and time to improve bloodlines of different types of horses, whether that's saddle horses, work horses, carriage horses, or most popularly, race horses. And so I just want to watch this documentary. This is our documentary for the week called Horsepower. It's on YouTube, and it goes through the histories of horse racing from kind of the inception of American horse racing all the way to kind of more modern day implications of the folks that were involved in horse racing. And so as you go forward in the documentary, do take note of the answers to these questions. What do people in the documentary consider the very first American sport? Quote in the documentary, hint, I'll give it to you, it's horse racing. What permeates all aspects of racing? This is an explicit quote from the documentary, so please key out for that. Who is represented in the history of horse racing? So think of not only the gender, race, and class of the jockeys, but I also want you to kind of take a note of the examples of how horse racing reflected the values and shifts in American history. So think about the horses themselves. What did the horses represent? Did they represent classist divide? Did they represent North versus South divide, gender divide, and how that is very explicitly represented in this sport, and how this sport kind of acts as pseudo warfare for these other kind of tensions, cultural tensions in the United States. So if you have any questions about that, please do let me know. And so to kind of continue on these tensions that we find, again, we have classist divides, we have racial divides. We also are starting to see gender divides in the United States as well. And so in terms of how women are involved in sports and active recreation, not very much in terms of how we see it today. Women were not granted the same rights as men, both politically and within sport and recreation. And this is really due to cultural and religious expectations that women just were not thought of as equals in this space. And so of the types of things that these women were allowed to do in the colonies, they were very non-competitive utilitarian type sports like walking, gardening, bathing, quilting, and horseback riding was acceptable within the confines of more of these domestic expectations for women. Most of the time, these utilitarian sports were just a way to develop skill sets that will make them better wives, make them better mothers. However, we do recognize that there are class differences between lower class and upper class women. Lower class women were permitted to accompany their husbands to watch sports, so they were actually able to see what sport was, maybe encourage some sort of fandom surrounding sports, but really they were permitted to only just watch, be spectators of these sports. Upper class women, on the other hand, were barred pretty much completely from witnessing any and all things surrounding sports. They thought it was too vulgar for the sensitive capacities of upper class women, but a lot of women did play games, not necessarily sports, but they would play card games within the home, even though upper class men were kind of one of the only demographics that were allowed to play sport. But when upper class women were not even allowed to view sport, let alone play sport. Age also greatly influenced the amount of access that girls and women had to be involved in the sporting space. Pretty much at a young age, girls and boys did the same activities. So they would play hide and seek, they would go sledding, they would play tag. But however, as girls got older, they were expected to kind of relinquish a lot of those activities and become housebound. They were expected to be motherly, be at the home, and so there were little to no opportunities for women to be involved in this sporting space. And so gender expectations through sport started all the way from the inception of our country, right? These ideas that women maybe aren't encouraged to be involved in sport, but boys and men are because of these prescribed duties in the United States. However, there was something very interesting that happened during this time. And again, this was the inception of the United States as we know it. And so while we started to kind of reshape these American values, we had very kind of strict understandings of what men were allowed to do and what women were allowed to do. And so this unique kind of culture, the shift for women, really took the form of what we call Republican motherhood. And Republican, as in republic meaning a democratic state, which the United States is, really shaped the direction for women and children in the United States. It was a brand new role for women in this new republic, America, that the women in the house, that again, they were still housebound, but women in the home were expected to raise the next generation of patriots by instilling these democratic values. Traditionally, in Europe, in England, this was a role devoted and by men in the home, that the men were teaching the boys, the girls, what was expected of them in these gendered roles. However, as you can see in this picture, a lot of the men in this new republic of the United States were politicians, they were businessmen, they were out doing stuff in the greater republic. And so that forced a lot of the children to be raised by who was at home, which was the mother. And so the war changed a lot of these gender roles, right? So physically, they wanted to be more physically dominant, and it was necessary for them to be physically fit in order to fit these prescribed gender roles. And women were hopefully very feeble because they didn't want them to have any physical superiority over the men, and they were forced to be left at home to tend to the children and provide the children an education. And so, as you can see here, this kind of Republican motherhood comic bit or whatever, the husband is leaving. I'm off to take care of the important stuff like politics and business. And the wife says, that's fine, dear. I'll educate the children on math, science, English, politics, theory. I mean, all these different things was left up to the woman. And so these women adhered to these prescribed gender roles that was expected of them as caretakers, as educators, and really created a desire for women to educate themselves. And so what had happened is that as these new mothers of this new republic called the United States, they implored with their young boys to give them more rights. Hey, I am here teaching you about these new democratic American values. I want you to give me more opportunities so that I can encourage and teach the gospel of being an American better. And so that was kind of one of the ways in which women started to gain traction in this fight for equality, was utilizing their sons, utilizing their children to then go be the decision makers of future generations and then grant those things towards women. And they did this without having any rights. They kind of utilized what was available to them and took advantage of that system. Eventually, war reaffirmed these new American gender roles and sexism through sport. They didn't necessarily want to grant equal opportunity for women, but they recognized that with these new gendered roles and expectations, they were to provide opportunities for educational benefit, but not necessarily through sport. And so all these things to say, we start to have the wheels turning through this new Republican motherhood that eventually would allow women to have equal opportunity in society and also through sport. We still have Native American sport being very popularized. Again, lacrosse was still the most popular sport among Native American groups and still held a lot of religious and political significances between tribes. However, we start to see a lot more European influence and now newly established American influence in how Native Americans are able to play their sports. And then as Europeans moved farther west, conflict became sadly unavoidable and very dreaded for both Europeans, colonizer Americans, as well as Native Americans pushing back against one another. This was unfortunately the beginning of the end of Native American dominance within the United States. However, it's important to note that many colonizers and westward expander folks going west feared the extreme physical superiority of Native American bowmen, noting that they might be the best marksmen in the world. And so, although war was unavoidable, and as we now look back, after the fact, we know what happens, there was still a lot of pushback, utilizing these sports skills, these utilitarian sports skills, to have this conflict and be able to push back against westward expansion. Sport during the Revolutionary War was very interesting. And again, this was really kind of encouraged. We signed the Declaration of Independence from England. This was a change towards a more independent, very self-sufficient American culture. And it really allowed Americans to feel inspired and fight for this newfound freedom against Great Britain. However, this freedom did not extend to women, Native, Black, or poor white Americans. It was very much mostly for upper class white Americans. And so for those who supported the war efforts, which most Americans did, or most folks who wanted to be in this new republic supported the war, they started to emphasize work ethic, not play ethic, in their local communities in order to allow for all of our energies to be devoted singularly towards the war efforts and not necessarily towards wasteful pastimes in which sport was distracting in those efforts. And so sport and physical activity, more for leisurely pursuits, was discouraged pretty much for the 2 decades that the war happened. However, it was documented that upon victory, and the 4th of July, we all know the story of 4th of July, that upon victory of the war, the entire nation would celebrate with games, bonfires, and sports, which really kind of established this tradition of the 4th of July, this idea of American values, this idea of American pastimes, that sport is included in that because it was a way for us to celebrate the end of the war, was to play sport. After the war, leaders started to acknowledge that folks who did play sport before the war were better soldiers. And so a lot of folks in military positions started to make that implicit link of sport and militarization, in which we're going to see many, many different examples down the line of how that link is very, very closely tied, even today. And so this new sport in the new America, political officials wanted Americans to play sport for the physical benefits of exercise. They still emphasized they discouraged the associated kind of nefarious activities of gambling and monetary and competitive benefits of sport. So they very much wanted to emphasize that sport can be a way to develop moral, physically fit Americans and American soldiers. They had this kind of quote of make your children hardy, active, and industrious. And eventually, given that war is very common in this time and even now, that they would become better soldiers because they recognized that folks who played sports before the American Revolutionary War were more physically fit. They were able to communicate better. They were able to understand the greater goal of winning, which at this time was to beat the British, to kill as many British folks as possible and to win the war, survive. And so because of that, this militarization of sport started to really become very systematic in the sense that not only did soldiers get trained, physical fitness trainings were through sport, that we started to see a lot of athletic clubs popping up around the colonies. And a lot of these athletic clubs were very exclusive to upper class white elites who could frankly be the only ones to afford to spend the money and time to achieve this member status of being involved in these sporting clubs. These can be anything from, at the time, fishing clubs, fox hunting, which was pictured, to eventually golf clubs, so country clubs, to track and field. But again, we're going to get to those later down the line. And so all this to say, it really established that sport could not only be used to benefit the militarization and conquest of nation ideologies, but sport can also be used to achieve upward social mobility. That if you were good enough in sport, that you were achieved not only social capital, right? You had clout amongst others in your communities, but you also achieved economic capital in which you're able to maybe make a better life for yourself through sport. And so this is where I kind of tie in, again, the modern day ramifications to this inception of sport being a social mobility escalator. The idea that sports has been one of the most influential contributors to shaping the belief about social mobility in American sport. This idea that if you play sports and if you're good enough, you can make a decent income, change the way that your lifestyle was or has been throughout your entire life. And more than any other cultural practice, sports are the most influential contributors to our understanding of bettering our lives, right? Not pursuits of other hobbies, not pursuits of other types of work, but sport. Because we've seen it for so long, we start to, literally at an inception of playing sport, we start to see these values being associated. And so we see it in the media, in movies, these rags to riches stories that someone from a working class background utilized sport to make a better life for themselves. And so I wanted us to read the Edson chapter 22, which is again on Canvas, to really kind of break down this assumption that sports can be a social mobility escalator through all these different means, right? And so we've seen certain sports be historical gatekeepers for those in different sociological groups, right, from horse racing to boxing. But I want us to first acknowledge that sports can be used to make a better life for yourself. It can be used as a social mobility escalator through other means outside of just becoming a professional athlete. Things like going and getting your education at a college, developing positive characteristics through workforce, popularity, and social benefit. Or if you are talented enough to make it professional, that is a way to achieve upward social mobility, right? However, there are a lot of other different maybe misconceptions, these myths surrounding sport as an upward social mobility escalator that I want us to really think very critically about as we go forward into this space of really seeing how and where sport as a cultural power force really lies. And so the first myth I want us to debunk is that sport provides a free college education. NC2A D1 and D2 athletes, not D3, because if you're a D3 college athlete, you cannot get scholarship. They're the only ones to get scholarship, and only about 3% of high school athletes actually get scholarship to go to play college in sport. That is now kind of shifted. I'd like to see kind of how NIL deals are changing kind of the fabric of how student athletes are getting paid in college. But all this to say, it is not very common to have a free college education while you're being a student athlete. Another myth is this idea that sport leads to a college degree. Unfortunately, fewer than half of college athletes graduate a degree, especially those who only go to college to play sport, who maybe don't have other desires to go to college other than just playing sport, hopefully go pro. 53% of NFL players have college degrees, 20% of NBA, and less than 10% of folks who play in the MLB and NHL. And there are some barriers to this. Obviously, demands of athletic schedules make it challenging to finish your classes or to pursue maybe more challenging or financially profitable majors in college. It might also be acknowledging that there are some folks who go to college for sport but maybe aren't prepared for the rigor of college, so they don't graduate, they maybe flunk out. As well as just generally inferior education systems in different communities, systemic racism that kind of pigeonholes certain athletes towards certain sports that are set them up for failure. But all these things to say that that is a very blatant myth in this kind of assumed understanding of sport being a social mobility escalator. Another myth is that a professional sports career is probable. We are literally going to see in the next slide that it is so incredibly challenging to go pro. And I'll give you those statistics in a second. Another myth is that sport is a way out of poverty, especially for racial minorities. And I think we need to be much more critical about this myth because, and as we're going to see as we go forward into this class, there are a lot of what I call, and what a lot of sports sociologists call, minority pigeonholing, in the sense that they're forced into certain sports because of racial assumptions that folks of color, particularly Black athletes, would excel in those sports. We find that for folks who play football, 70% of people who play football are Black. 83% of those who play basketball are Black, while there's a very small percentage of those athletes becoming professional athletes. And so kind of going into the previous myth, we pigeonhole certain racial groups towards these sports that unfortunately set athletes up, an overwhelming amount, 99% of athletes, up for failure. And so when you tell a lot of these young athletes, particularly minoritized, racially minoritized and ethnic minority athletes, young people, that one of the only ways in which they're able to achieve upward social mobility is through sport, that is unfortunately setting them up for failure. And so, and again, we're going to see the statistics in a moment, but there's a lot of really interesting quotes from the book that really kind of emphasize this idea that we are forcing these young, particularly Black athletes and other athletes of color, into these systems that will set them up for failure lifelong, perpetuating this cycle of poverty for racial minority groups. And we see that through many generations of sport. And so again, do take note of the quotes from William Ellerby and Charles Barkley. I think that they're very explicit in their criticisms for this system, but nonetheless, this is still a system that is happening all the time, even today. Another myth is that because of Title IX, women have more opportunities for upward social mobility through sport. More girls and women do play sport now more than ever. However, very few actually get an opportunity to be professional athletes in sport, although that statistic is growing. And even fewer women are able to be leaders in those sporting spaces. And we're going to see that when we get to the 1970s when Title IX was passed and really kind of how that all shook out. But again, that will come in the following weeks. And then finally, the idea that being in a professional sports career for the folks that do make it, right, provides security for life. Yes, professional athlete pay is very high, but the career is very short. Typically, it's about 3 to 5 years compared to, let's say, 30 years plus in a non-athletic type career in which you're able to accrue much more money, much more stability with a long-term plan. After retirement, there's many athletes that don't necessarily have a plan for the abrupt stop. And again, depending on the culture of the sport, depending on the longevity of your position, you might not really have a lot of money and securities and plans set up. Although there is kind of a shift towards educating athletes now on financial independence, financial agency. There's still staggering statistics that for a lot of professional athletes, a lot of them go bankrupt maybe less than a decade after their professional career ends. This is a quote from Gary Sales. About 95% of NBA players need to find a job after their careers end, and about 81% of those players are bankrupt when they retire from the sport. And so again, I think that this comes from financial illiteracy in a lot of sports contexts, which I think is now changing. We're starting to have a lot more educational programs for young professional athletes. But all these things to say, we really need to start debunking these myths and kind of assumptions around sport as a social mobility escalator, because it is truly just so improbable for athletes to make it big as a pro athlete. There are other ways to have a long, stable, financially secure life by utilizing sport to go to college, get a degree, by learning characteristics that will make you a more efficient employee, that you're able to have a long-term 30+ year career. You're able to have benefits of being an athlete. People perceive athletes very differently than non-athletes, and so a lot of people utilize that to their advantage. And then just other means of acknowledging that if you are talented enough, and again, you can see these statistics, these extremely staggering statistics from either going from high school straight to pro, high school to NC2A, or college sports into pro. It is extremely improbable to really make it big. And so there's other ways to utilize sports to achieve a long, happy, healthy life. And very rarely does it come from being a professional athlete. And so all these things to say, I want us to reflect on this chapter, right? What was this most surprising myth from this chapter that you read? And do you think, and should sports and social mobility be taught to all youth athletes? Like, let's say in their Pee Wee football days or the CYO soccer. Do you think that young athletes already know these myths behind sport as a social mobility escalator? Do you think that if they did know, or if they're ignorant to the fact of these things, that it would change their mindset on putting school first and then going professional for professional athletes that maybe don't have a college degree? Do you think that this will kind of change that culture of sport being one of the only ways out, and putting an emphasis towards education, towards trade, towards other pursuits other than sport? I don't know what you think. So that is it for this week. Please review the Revolutionary Period study guide. Know the basic characteristics, people of influence, as well as sporting ideas of the following belief systems of the Great Awakening versus the Enlightenment. Understand frontier and backcountry sport differences compared to city sports, and really kind of the associated values between those two groups. Know the roles of women in society and their involvement in sport. So really thinking about the differences between lower class women, upper class women, and how Republican motherhood kind of spearheaded our shift towards allowing women to be in American cultural space. Review the answer from the horsepower slides. Again, let me know if you have questions about that. Understand that money is an incentive for people to play or gamble on sport, but then as kind of a, again, modern day ramification of that, discern the facts and myths from the Edson chapter 22 discussing social mobility in sport. So really understanding what the facts versus the myths are of sport as a social mobility escalator. And so that is it for this week. Next week, we're going to be covering 40 years of sport between 1820 and 1860 and what we call the antebellum health reforms, as well as sporting reforms. So please let me know if you have any questions about this week's content, and I will see you next week. Bye.